The enlargement package is a report that is issued normally in October that provides an overview of where Ukraine stands on the different chapters of accession. You know that this has been revised, now we have clusters.
Because together with the European operators, we managed really fast to regulate and to work on the mechanism that helped 4.4 million Ukrainians to stay in touch.
Hello and welcome to Ukrainian Flames, a special project by Ukraine Media Centre and NGO Euro-Atlantic Course, and I'm your host, Matt Wickham. In this episode, we'll talk about Ukraine's integration into the EU market. And if you want to learn more about this subject, please continue watching this video and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss out in our videos in the future. Ukraine's desire to become a member in the European Union represents a significant political turning point in the country's history. However, the ongoing war with Russia within its borders presents unique challenges for the country's path to EU membership. Ukraine is focusing on strengthening economic and integration ties with the EU in order to accelerate the accession process. Let's hear from our first guest to hear how.
This is a process that many countries have gone through, including my own country, Spain, at the time. And this had a transformative effect for the society. So it's good that all the elements in the civil society and business and the authorities get on board and are working together towards this endeavor of joining the EU. What I would like to emphasize, and I agree with Dimitro in the assessment that for the time being we'll have a very good roadmap on the table, and that is the association agreement. The association agreement between the EU and Ukraine is one of the most advanced that we have in terms of not only regulatory approximation, but also possibilities for market access. So this agreement that has been enforced already for several years now is de facto the legal basis that is allowing Ukraine to integrate more and more into the EU. And I'm talking here notably about the internal market. This is one of the objectives of the association agreement. So this is something that the Balkans did not have. So it's an advantage for Ukraine as well. So that means that you can already start to reap the benefits of having access to the EU internal market and activate several of the provisions there, which allow Ukraine to benefit as any other member state of the same treatment as regards access to the internal market. This is the first thing. Now, about the accession process itself, is more of a political process. It is strongly based on regulatory approximation, but not only. Also, the quality of the institutions, the enforcement, and the setup of the institutional framework that is responsible for this enforcement plays a big role. And in that sense, the EU has been discussing with Ukraine through different sectoral meetings and structures how to improve this. This will be the first year that the EU is including Ukraine in the annual enlargement package. The enlargement package is a report that is issued normally in October that provides an overview of where Ukraine stands on the different chapters of accession. You know that this has been revised, now we have clusters. We have, for instance, one cluster that is called internal market. So we have already worked on the first draft, the first version of this cluster. And I would like also to thank the Ukrainian authorities, particularly the Ministry of Economy. I see that Taras Kashka was there before, for the input that they also provided for this exercise, because this goes two ways. But it's true that at the end now, the European Commission will present a report on where Ukraine stands in the different areas of regulatory approximation. I cannot say now what the final outcome will be, because the European Commission will only provide some recommendation or some opinion, but then this will have to be assessed by member states. You know that the Council of the EU plays a big role when it comes to accession. It was the Council of the EU that decided that Ukraine should become a candidate country, and it is also the Council of the EU that will decide if we eventually open negotiations. So this is a very political process, but we think that with the strength of the association agreement, with the commitment of Ukraine that we are seeing, and with continued efforts, if we sustain this work, we sustain this enthusiasm, then we could get there faster rather sooner than later. And finally, just to mention about, it's a bit linked with the previous session, but about the internal market. We're also already, as I said, working to make sure that Ukraine can get integrated into the EU internal market. There are several aspects of the agreement that we can use. We have a legal basis for that. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have already an agreement that allows Ukraine to start to be more and more integrated. And we think that this is a process that is inevitable. Ukraine will become more and more enshrined into the EU internal market by means of integration in supply chains or more and more complex trade relations. There are challenges, of course, with some sectors, agriculture, etc. We're working on that, but we are getting there.
Ukraine made significant regulatory changes with the EU in 2022. Ukraine enacted new digital legislation, becoming the first non-EU member state to do so in collaboration with EU member states. Olena Vintoniak, People's Deputy of Ukraine, tells more.
Actually, 29th of July, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine adopted resolution on certain measures related to performing obligations of Ukraine in European integration, and it determined the main task was to adapt the legislation of Ukraine to the EU acquis, and also ensure that the acts that are legislative acts in Ukraine are in line with European ones. As for the operational level, the resolution provided for creation in each committee of Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine subcommittees on adaptation of Ukrainian legislation to provisions of EU acquis. We can say that for all Euro integration draft laws, profile committees have to have the tables of correspondence of the draft law to the association agreement, and also have in their disposal the official translation of the EU Act. I would like to mention straight away that actually with the official translation, we had some issues, not a single time, because it's not always that such translation is available. And this resolution provides for separate tasks for our committee on Ukrainian integration to the EU. And first of all, they are as follows. During the previous consideration of the draft law, our committee sees the availability or lack of provisions related with the adaptation of the Ukrainian legislation to EU provisions. And we are providing the relevant conclusion to the profiled committee. Secondly, before the second reading, we are making analysis of the initiative on whether it is corresponding the legislation, whether it's in line with European legislation. And we always, Ms. Olena, I'm sorry, we have 1 minute. Physically, they are interrupting us. Okay, if physically, I will briefly mention that it is well provisioned for by the resolution of Verkhovna Rada, but unfortunately, as of today, the reality is a bit different, because as of today, in the secretariat of our committee, there are 7 people working who actually are working 24/7, and still it is not expanded, this secretariat, but we are trying to involve other experts. We are trying to constantly work with the European missions that are giving us aid in processing the draft laws, because almost all of them are going through our Euro Integration Committee, as we call it. And recently it was confirmed that we had the meeting of the committee on these points of when you are crossing the border, and also our specialists are helping us with practice, with legislative practice, and also with how we can interpret that into our legislation in our lives. And the opinion of our committee is that still we have to be expanded. The secretariat has to be expanded as much as possible because all these auxiliary institutions is good, but we have to have this institutional memory and some things that will be ensured by our committee, by our profile.
In 2022, Ukraine implemented measures to enable free international mobile roaming in the EU, ensuring 4.4 million displaced Ukrainians were connected. Lilia Malon, member of the National Commission for the State Regulation of Electronic Communications, tells in detail.
Our 2022 started on a very positive note because at that moment, we had the new sectoral legislation on digital communication, on regulator, and it was the first story when Ukraine implemented the new European legislation at the same time with the states members of the EU, and people know that a huge set of directives that existed in the EU was substituted with the Code of Digital Communications. And based on this document, we developed and adopted the law on digital communications and on regulator. And with this thing, we did sufficient progress in performing our obligations under the association agreement, and actually a big step towards the integration into the joint digital market. But actually, this positive note for the whole country, just like for all the sectors, it ended on the 24th of February 2022, as soon as the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started. And unfortunately, the sector of digital communications and the infrastructure during the year of 2022 suffered a lot of losses, and it was very often an object of shellings, and it was ruined to a great extent because we faced the fact that civil infrastructure, the main role of which is to support connection between people, was used actually by our enemy in order to deprive us of the connection and of the opportunity to have access to information. And the whole year of 2022, we as a regulator, together with our colleagues and together with the market, our key task was to preserve the communication for Ukrainians and do everything possible in order for Ukrainians to have the opportunity to call their relatives and to hear their voices. We did that not only in Ukraine, but also abroad. And Mr. Taras Kachka partially mentioned already the field of roaming. And this is probably the subject to our pride, because together with the European operators, we managed really fast to regulate and to work on the mechanism that helped 4.4 million Ukrainians to stay in touch who were forced to be on the territory of the EU. And this gave us a huge step forward in order to talk that the field of roaming is going to be the first one in the EU. So we already ended the amending the association agreement in this field, and we are doing our homework, so to say, on implementing relevant acts of ACWIS. And next year, we are going to talk seriously about Ukraine joining the roaming zone of the EU. So now I can just confirm your phrase that our field suffered a lot because of the destruction and challenge, and we have assessment of the World Bank and our own assessments we were also calculating. But I would like to say that the field of digital communication is really dynamic, and the connection is what is needed every day. We had blackouts, we had problems with the heating in our homes. People were ready to stand with that, but we could not refuse having the connection, because the first thing we do is we are going to different social networks, or we are calling our relatives. So our operators, they don't wait till the end of the war, and the networks that suffered, they were repaired, very often under shellings, and people were risking their lives. And unfortunately, in our sector, we have human losses during actually repair of these networks, and operators are still investing and they are updating the infrastructure. Even now, we are not waiting for the war to end. It's a very dynamic process, and of course, it's impossible to comment what is happening on temporarily occupied territories, because having experience when our operators were coming to the territories that were deoccupied, the infrastructure was ruined almost to the zero very often. And therefore, it's going to be a certain challenge for this infrastructure to start working in there. But that is what is done right now. And actually, we are repairing our resources. We are looking for new opportunities, and also among European partners, all the possible donations. For example, we see that as some equipment or maybe financial aid for this sector to be rebuilt. What I would also like to comment on, in spite of the fact that our task number one was to ensure the connection to Ukrainians, we were actively moving in the framework of the association agreement to the joint digital market of the EU. And I can proudly say that only during the last year, in spite of all the conditions that we were in, we managed to adopt 24 normative legislative acts on digital communications with the regulator. Yes, we have a lot of work to do this year, but our tempos are pretty fast because our field is really dynamic, and for sure we are not negotiating about some postponing or so on. Therefore, we are moving really fast, and we managed to do 5 points in the framework of the association agreement. And also in your study, you mentioned the spectral policy and harmonization of using the spectrum with the EU. I would like to mention that according to our obligations, we have 38 implementation acts in the framework of spectral policy, and 26 out of them are fully implemented, 7 implemented partially, and the remaining part, of course, is the issue that is going to be considered afterward, because using spectrum is a really sensitive topic. I would like also to comment on the painful topic, and a lot of people are not thinking of this. This is implementing 5G network. It will be a very important step for Ukraine that we will do. But of course, after the war and during the war, we have to pay more accent to rebuild the networks that we lost. And only the next step will be the issue of 5G. But it's not the cure, so to say. Yes, Europe is moving fastly to 5G networks, but even there are certain details, and many countries, they are developing 5G at the cost of different foundations and not with their own budgets. So I think that for Ukraine, it has to become one of the points of dialogue with the EU, access to different programs, because in the European Union, the so-called resilience plan, there is from which different countries, and they are receiving, like, for different projects, first of all, projects for like broadband projects, they are receiving money in order to do that in their countries. So for Ukraine, I think that potentially it could have become a good chance. A few more moments, because as for the EU directives, in the EU it is known as a post-reduction directive, which is reducing costs for the networks. And it's our obligation to implement that. But it's a directive under discussion. People try not to talk about that. But the truth is that it did not work well in the EU. And the last 2 years, it's not applied in practice. And there's a 5G toolbox, so-called, which came instead of that. And now the EU is discussing the so-called Gigabit Act about gigabit infrastructure, which is expected to be adopted maybe even this autumn. And here we have to have understanding of the policy about the broadband development, and Ukraine is under the conditions of war. Unfortunately, Ukraine gained unique experience how to ensure sustainability of networks, and it's a huge added value of ours for European Union. And believe me, now there is huge interest to sustainability of networks in Ukraine. This is something we can come to European Union with. This is the case when they are starting from us.
Ukraine faces a difficult task in rebuilding its devastated industries and infrastructure. While trade with the EU is expected to grow, Ukraine recognises the need to expand into new markets in order to mitigate the economic impact of the ongoing war. Our next guest, Bulana, analyst at the Ukrainian Center for European Policy, tells more.
We were underlining that Ukraine will face problems related not only with implementation, but also with the fact that we have to develop our infrastructure, we have to rebuild the industry, we have to rebuild the quality infrastructure, and we have to work on many things related to some physical things, that we will have to rebuild our economy and infrastructure in order to serve the economy. Therefore, actually, we have that in our study, and we've been writing about that not a single time, that this is not the single problem that Ukraine will face. As for the trade policy, I think that Mr. Taras Kachka can tell more about it, but for me, it's obvious that our trade with the EU will grow, and it will happen. Why? Because even the countries who are candidates, who receive the candidates status, we are in a unique situation because we have the war going on and it's not to our advantage. So their trade with the neighboring countries grew in the nearest years. So I expect actually that we will get benefits from that. Access to internal market, we will be able to export more. But now we have really like physical limitations. And we will have to look for the new markets. We will have to develop processing and reprocessing. But the issue...
You've been watching the special project by Ukraine Media Center and Euro-Atlantic course dedicated to the Russian-Ukrainian war, Ukraine in Flames. In the description under this video, you can find information about how you can help Ukraine fight Russian aggression. If you find our work useful, please like and share this video. Slava Ukraini!